I think as somebody who's entering into a startup, you might get enamored with fundraising size, but having been in a startup, it's actually not an indication of a successful product market fit or commercial model or a great customer experience. So that's one metric I definitely ignore.
Great to have you on the show. I want to start by asking you worked in a lot of corporate jobs, right? You worked at KPMG, Macquarie, a bunch of other like really corporate places, and now you've been in startup land for a little while. So I want to ask, what was the initial transition there? What kind of led you out of the corporate world into the startup scene? Was there any sort of moment that triggered that?
Yeah, earlier in my career, I was on the other side. So I was assessing, investing in internet businesses. I was also in gaming spaces and working on developing commercial models, supporting digital businesses on their strategies. I spent most of my earlier career in consumer tech space, particularly on the corporate VC side, strategy, M&A, as well as early stage startup and scale up company side in the latter years. As a non-technical person, I really didn't think there was a pathway for me into early stage startups, especially with someone with my random background. And I found out that was the furthest thing from the truth, because there was a pent-up demand for generalists who were malleable, learn fast, solve problems, have impact to scaling the business, and effectively helping to create defensibility from both internal and external shocks that an early stage constantly experiences through their journey. And the way I transitioned, because it wasn't so big, and I don't really want to show my age right now, but it wasn't so big back in the day. I think Blackbird VC only just really started coming to fruition around that time. And so it was a very nascent period for investing, early stage investing in Australia. And there wasn't much of a community or meetups around this space. For me, I had to just basically reach out to founders that I admired and identify problems that they were solving that deeply interested me. And I think it was hard, I'm not going to lie, to make that sort of leap, because we're going from a very structured and well-resourced environment to one that's grey, ambiguous, chaotic, all of the above, crazy. And so luckily I did get my first foray into startups, and that was about 7 years ago when I joined a little online bus booking business, which actually ended up scaling to about 200 million in gross sales a year. And ended up helping, millions of customers travel easier. And so I was in an area called business operations. And what is business operations? The purpose and the role of my team was to drive growth of the business by either launching and scaling new initiatives, or just even optimizing day-to-day operations, or even just a mixture of both. I was fortunate enough to work on a lot of different problems across product and marketing, customer success. And that was to ensure that the business is solving the right problems in line with the company level objectives. And so some of the projects I would work on would be, hey, we've got a bit of backlog with our customer queries. How can we improve our customer experience, which is deeply important in the online travel space, getting that sort of real-time ability to connect with somebody and have your query answered, because you're about to miss your bus and it's going to impact your journey and your experience. So looking at streamlining processes to handle these queries and looking at ways to improve NPS. I worked with marketing to launch loyalty programs to improve retention rates. And so there was a variety of stuff, and I wasn't an expert in anything, but what I was deeply curious about how things worked. And I had a very growth oriented and learning mindset, like a baby just coming into the world. And then more recently, I was the head of operations at Simply Wall Street, which is a B2C SaaS app. And we helped over 5 million retail investors make better stock decisions. I don't know if you've used it.
I have. I did have a little bit of a play around in the lead up to this, but not yet.
Yeah, it's great, isn't it? And I think for me, I get attracted to not just any startup, but a startup that's solving a business problem or a or a problem that really hits like a bit of a personal note with me. For me, like I was actually a user of Simply Wall Street before because it helped my personal retail investing journey, and I really had a lot of asymmetric information. I didn't have the clunky sort of Bloomberg terminal, prohibitively expensive. I believe they're like 150,000 per terminal or per license, something crazy like that, which a hedge fund or a large company would have. And as a result, not have that same sort of level playing field. And what I saw is that business and the founder, Al, deeply passionate about that space. And he was leveling this access, and he was simplifying the journey for the average Jane or Joe. So that's what really attracted me to that business. And then now currently I'm a VP in the finance team at Pet Circle, which is obviously a leading online pet company in Australia. And it was a tough decision actually leaving Simply Wall Street, because you've gone from an early stage business, startup, solving super interesting problems, to a business that is doing exactly the same thing, but it's in its scale up journey as well. And the decision really came to my skill set. I wanted to level up. I wanted to expand my toolkit. I wanted to join a company during that journey. And I fell in love with the founder's stories and ambition to build a great enduring business that aims to solve all of our furry and scaly friends' needs. And that's what really excited me about it. And hearing that vision through the interview process from Mike, our CEO, and our CFO, and just the excitement really brought me in. And what I do there and my team does is help the business to make the best decisions possible and enable business leaders to make the right choices for the customer and the company, and support existing business lines like optimizing them, help the business to plan better, and look at new growth opportunities as well. So entering in new markets or adjacent businesses in the pet space.
That's super cool. No, thank you so much for sharing. Because, yeah, I think you've done some really cool things in your career, and it's super cool to hear even there some of the details of what you do on a day-to-day basis. But I do want to ask one thing in a bit more detail, and so you can touch on it a little bit through that. But if someone is looking to join a startup, and you mentioned there some things, attachment to the actual mission, how does it relate to your current skills and things like that. But I wonder if someone's looking to make the leap as you did, what kind of things should someone be looking for when they're going to join a startup? Are there any things that perhaps if you were if you had to wind the clock back and be like, how would I do this? What kind of things now would I look for in a startup that would, that would maybe increase the odds it's going to be a good experience for me? What sort of things would you look for?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually have started to do this a lot more in terms of interviewing the startup that's interviewing me, or interviewing the business that's interviewing me. And I think it's important for people to spend the vast majority of your time like figuring out, is this the right company for you to join above anything else? Because that needs to be aligned. Otherwise, you're just not going to be excited coming into work every day, especially when things get really... And so it's really important. So I would ask some certain questions before joining a startup. You could probably do a bit of desktop research as well, but in particular, testing the rigor of the business model. Is it a big market size? What does the team look like? Are they strong executors? Is it diverse? Are they creative? Are they good operators? Because diversity is super important. And in my experience, I've optimized for companies that were operating in really big growing markets. So online travel is huge. Pets is a $15 billion market just in Australia alone. Retail investing, like Simply Wall Street is tackling, there's about 300 to 400 million retail investors worldwide. So those are huge growing markets. More people are entering into that market as well. More people are taking note of it and also paying for services and goods in those markets. I also tried to get a sense of how the product was doing before it launched. So before an interview, I would just go and do that desktop research that I mentioned, dive into customer feedback, your Trustpilot or your Google reviews. And this would give me a sense of if the customer feedback was really telling me that they're solving a real pain point for a customer, or that the problem has just been invented because it sounds cool, but it's not really a sustainable business. And I think it's also another thing, which is what I've noticed about it and drives me crazy, is that there's a lot of marketing around fundraising. And so I think as somebody who's entering into a startup, you might get enamored with fundraising size, but having been in a startup, it's actually not an indication of a successful product market fit or commercial model or a great customer experience. So that's one metric I definitely ignore. So you see a lot of companies going, wow, we've raised like $100 million, we've raised $150 million. And now you're seeing in the news, oh, wow, we haven't nailed our sort of revenue targets or some of the metrics that we had planned to hit. We're letting go of 15 to 20% of the workforce. And this is happening a lot now. Like I'm seeing a lot of stories come up in the local news. Just even yesterday, there was a company that came out where they were letting go of 16% of the workforce after they had just raised $125 million led by the Atlassian founders. Yeah, it's important to just distinguish those two. And if there isn't any information or little information, because it's very hard with startups that they're private companies. By the time you get to the interview, I would ask my interviewees actually about these topics. And I would ask them point blank, and I have done this in interviews where I've asked, hey, what are your actual challenges? Is it activation that's the issue? Is it acquiring customers? Is it retaining customers? And really deep dive, and whatever information they are able to give me. And if they try to like gloss over it, I would be like, something suspect there. So I think that's really important for you to dig into that information and not be afraid. Just because they're interviewing you doesn't mean you cannot interview them back. It's a two-way. And so for me, I've been an angel investor. I'm also an operator in startups and scale-ups. And I also focus most of my attention on the founding and exec team, because in early stage businesses, revenue might not be a metric that you can ascertain. Certain metrics might not be there. I tend to look at, are the founders the right people that are building the product in this market? Are they a customer? Do they know the customer well? Or are they just doing it for bragging rights? Do they have passion that can be sustainable for decades? It's tiring building a startup. There are more bad days than there are good days. So you've got to have grit and big, bold ambitions to change the world and help the customer, and not just optimize for, the financial return. I'm going to be a multimillionaire out of this. You've got to deeply love what you're doing. And do they care like beyond the product as well? So do they care about the people, and do they care about building a business that's a generational business that will transcend time and effectively have long-lasting impacts for their customers? And so that's important to like distill. And one red flag for me really is if they are covering up these challenges and problems that I've mentioned earlier, I would just counter with, what area of the business do you think that you can improve on? And look at their response. And their response is they've shown humbleness and real ownership of problems, and that there's work to do. They're really grounded in reality. And it is about collectively getting together and solving that, rather than glossing it over and then everything blows up. And then finally, for me, is this a team I can learn from and want to learn from? And even though a founder or a CEO has different skill sets to you, there are these like important sort of meta skills beyond the technical and those hard skills that you can learn just by observing how they communicate, how they prioritize, how they handle stress. And if you can observe those, then it's incredibly powerful to learn off them. And also, you don't want to feel like the smartest person in the room when you're with this team or the founding team. And if you are, then you're not going to learn anything. So I would avoid businesses like that as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's really great. Yeah, I think, like you were saying, if the company is going really well and there are things to share, then they'll be more open to sharing them. Whereas if things perhaps aren't going so well, then maybe they won't be so forthcoming with like how things are going. So I think that's a great way of working out without like perhaps getting a response, but you can still have an idea of what's going on. I think that's really cool. I think, yeah, there's a lot of good things in there that I think are quite useful, and things that I didn't think about, looking up the reviews and doing things that way to try and see what do people actually think about this. And an interesting point about funding, because I feel, yeah, like you said, there's a lot of like media usually around like raises and stuff, and it's easy to get to think, oh, they raise lots of money, must be a good company. Like, I can sort of disregard a lot of the things that you did mention around, is the customer having a good experience with this product, like other founders like going to stay in it for the long haul, things like that. Yeah, I like that a lot. Definitely definitely gonna use some of those tips there.
Yeah, and if all fails, watch a lot of true crime, because you get really good. Like looking up all
Yeah.
stuff.
Oh, that's amazing. I want to ask too, yeah, you mentioned a little bit in there around, you want to be in a team that is going to help you grow and learn and develop. You don't want to feel like the smartest person in the room. I feel like this is something that you do really well. You've done plenty of learning outside of work. You did a master's of finance, all these like different VC things. I know you've done a few of those kind of almost like boot camp style training things. I'm interested to hear how you think about developing your skills both in your role and outside of that, and how you've used those like external things and perhaps your current roles as well to progress, I guess.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think for me, like university can only teach you so much. I think once you get into the workforce and you start actually interacting with customers, interacting with various functions, and with your team, that's when the real lessons start to occur. And I think it's just about being open and being like deeply curious and understanding why we do what we do. And so if there's any sort of skill that I would suggest getting, is getting curiosity. And I think that encourages sort of the learning, the exchange of ideas. We communicate better with one another in our team, builds deeper connection and empathy to what a teammate or a different function is doing, fuels innovation. And I think when we're curious, we look at tough problems in a more creative light and try to sit in the problem till we deeply understand why it's so challenging. So in my case, I wanted to learn more about product management and growth, because at Simply Wall Street, for example, I was interacting with a lot of those, the development of those strategies and building those teams. And I didn't have any depth of understanding of it, just what I've read online, but I didn't want that superficial understanding. So I started to invest a lot more time just learning from others, setting up catch-ups, coffee catch-ups with people, just to understand what do they do, why does it drive impact to the business, why is it so important, breaking it up for me as well. And then doing my own sort of investment after hours in training. So I started doing those Reforge courses, which are a great way to level up your understanding of product and growth, and understanding things around how product managers do their jobs and how strategies are set at that level, how they even interview their users, even from a growth perspective, like how do you build like a growth model in a tech business? What does that look like? How do you think about pricing, monetization, like all these various tidbits of that make up sort of growth, which is like deeply complicated, because it is very, I would say, a newer area and very different to your traditional marketing channels. And so, yeah, for me, it was just about investing a lot of time in leveling up, reading a lot, subscribing to a lot of newsletters, following people on Twitter as well to learn, and effectively, yeah, just being really deeply curious about things and wanting to understand the why. Not because I wanted to execute that job, but because it helped me to build more empathy and understanding, especially because I was on the leadership team, and if we were supporting these teams in terms of growing them and building them and helping to define strategies with them. And I needed to have that understanding. Otherwise, yeah, it would just, I would add no value effectively.
Yeah, I think it's interesting you mentioned earlier about aligning the company that you, or the startup that you're going to try and join, or the company that you're working for, with something that is like a personal pain point, or something that you're actually interested in, a product that perhaps you use anyway. I think that really helps with the curiosity piece, right? Is if it's something that hits one of your pain points and you're actually interested, and then you also work there, then I think then obviously you're going to be much more interested than having some pain points or whatever and then working somewhere that's completely unrelated. You're going to have better odds at being interested, right, if you work somewhere that's actually relevant to yourself. So yeah, I think that's super good.
100%.
Nice. Let's continue on. I know we've only got a little bit of time left, so I want to touch on sort of your career more broadly rather than day to day. And I want to ask career advice. So I'm sure you've seen many sort of juniors or junior marketers, growth people, whatever it might be, product come through different companies that you've worked at. And I wonder, what is some advice that you see these people, what are some mistakes maybe that you see these people make that you wish you could just tell everyone that's starting their career, don't make this mistake? Is there anything there?
Yeah, I've had this kind of common career advice come my way, and it's really either from your parents or from respectfully older people. I'm just going to say, and they've communicated this often. Hey, you've got to know your worth when going for a role, and when they talk about worth, it's effectively your compensation, your total compensation. And I do understand that it comes from a good place, and it's ensuring that you and others are valuing you and your time. But the biggest mistake I see people make, especially the ones that are trying to go from a corporate job into a startup or a scale up, is trying to optimize sort of their salaries. And so I think early on in your career, you should definitely optimize for learning over earning a high salary and even the role as well. And I strongly believe that if you invest in learning first, you are going to develop that highly sought after skill set, which then translates into that valuable role, which a high salary is ultimately a byproduct of. And so just in my experience recruiting and interviewing candidates, and you get to the offer stage, especially new ones coming in around the 2 to 4 year experience mark, and they've come from large corporates and they think, oh yeah, like therefore I should be earning even more. And so generally they want to try and get maybe 5 to 10K more, which after tax is like totally immaterial. Or they want the role title in a startup because the one that they're going for isn't sexy enough for them. And so it's all totally immaterial because you're foregoing the valuable steep learning curve, the immense amount of ownership you get from day one, and also the conviction you build in yourself through many opportunities of being tested, failing consistently, and then learning and picking yourself up and being stronger for it, which you just don't get that opportunity at a larger organization because there's just so much cushioning and protection. So I would really caution people to really think about why they're going for a startup role and not really like optimize for that earning, because what might happen is, because startups are resource constrained or scale ups are resource constrained, it might not be in the budget, and then you might miss out on an opportunity which you can't get back, and into an opportunity which a lot of people are vying to get into.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like you mentioned it, but yeah, today I feel like startups are the new like sexy thing to do, right? And so you want the nice title, like things like that. But yeah, I completely agree. I think sometimes the learning, particularly when you're young, is just important. And I think you said it quite well where you were saying the learning and the knowledge that you gain will lead to a high salary like sometime in the future. You don't necessarily need that right now. In fact, sometimes choosing a high salary when you're young might like limit the growth in some cases where you're being like overpaid to do nothing sometimes. So yeah, I completely agree. I think it's important for people to recognize that. Cool. Let's do one more. And this is a question for you about if you could rewind the clock. It's a question I ask all the guests, and it is, Nan, where you are now, rewind the clock back to when you were just graduating university, heading out into the world, knowing everything that you know now. Is there anything that you would do differently, or is there any advice that you wish you would have known then that you know now?
Yeah, I think I've definitely put my foot in it a lot. I've definitely made a lot of mistakes. And I'm also really grateful for that. So don't shy away from failure. Absolutely not. But having said that, there are things that you can mitigate at least the impact, because it can often be very often when you get hit and you get constantly hit, very demoralizing to your confidence. And it often does take you a bit of time to pick up, but realizing that things aren't personal, this is just the way of the world. You don't have the cushioning of the university. You don't have that protection anymore. And so for me, I wish I had developed self-awareness about myself, my behaviors, what I'm really good at, what I'm terrible at, and really being more open-minded in trying to unlearn the ones that were holding me back from growing. And sometimes it can be a little bit humbling. It can take you a steps back, but I think that's okay. But I think the way university's been set up and the way society pits people against each other in terms of competition and all that kind of stuff, it really does get into your head and that you want to move forward. And for me, I wish I had just taken a step back to address some of those areas. And I can give an example, but one thing I did struggle with was going from being like a really strong sort of individual contributor to a people leader. And what I found is it's like a completely different job, requiring new abilities, totally new set of problems that require completely different muscles, skills, and tools. And I had to really make significant changes from just going deep into my work and being really myopic and really good at like just executing a task or building that skill set, to looking at the bigger picture, understanding, communicating the context to the team in which we operate in. And I went from being a master of my craft also to taking a step to trying to train others to be good at their job, because that's when you're successful, when you've actually been able to help others. And I went from solving with what tools and resources I had to allocating resources and influencing others, which became more important in this role. Going from like that functional mindset where you're just thinking about your own function, what's required to do the job really well, to what's actually good for the company mindset. And often you have to unlearn a lot of these things. It takes a bit of time because it's like you're a computer. You're programmed a certain way because of society, external factors, internally driven as well. And for me, like I sought a lot of help externally, and I wasn't afraid that I was seeking help externally or internally, or telling people I don't know how to do this and I need to get better at this. How do I go about doing this? And showing that kind of vulnerability. And some people might see it as weakness, but it isn't. It's so powerful to just be vulnerable, because this weight just lifts off you and you're like, oh, great, I can learn without any sort of judgment. And they're probably thinking exactly the same thing. And so I think, yeah, really focusing on trying to unlearn and having that self-awareness about yourself a bit more, your internal engineering effectively, like your makeup, spending a lot more time on knowing yourself rather than knowing the business externally. That can come second. I wish I had done that a lot. I wish I'd done an exercise where I was trying to figure out what actually motivates me rather than what do my parents want me to do. Or when you graduate from a university degree, everyone goes into an investment bank or a big four or a consulting firm, and that's like a mark of success, when it actually really isn't. There are alternative career paths. And because I'd been so conditioned, I only thought success was through that path, and it didn't bring me any joy. And that's probably why I changed so many times as well, because I was just getting deeply frustrated, and I was like, why am I getting frustrated? But I just didn't spend enough time on knowing myself, knowing the creative side of myself, knowing what problems I'm drawn to. And now I'm more free and open about it. I'm very honest about it, because I don't want to, keep switching, for example. I want to just solve a problem that I'm deeply passionate about and that I love doing day in, day out.
No, I think that's so important, and it's great to see like you go on that journey and the self development journey that you've been on and learning more about yourself, the self awareness. I think completely agree. I think it's almost like we're all sort of somewhere, trying to chasing something, and so I think it's cool that you can now look back and see how far you've come. I think you're doing some really amazing stuff. So really, really fortunate that we're able to hear your wisdom. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. We might wrap it up there. So I want to ask before we head off, where can people go to find more about you and connect with you after this? After listening, is there anywhere that you'd like to send people?
Yeah, look, I'm on Twitter, I'm on Instagram, but that's more just like my travel photos and food photos. On LinkedIn. Yeah, so do connect with me on LinkedIn. Always happy to connect with people. Do a lot of startup meets. I'm deeply passionate about the community and investing. So if you want to get any, I don't know, career advice, I don't know why you want to come to me for career advice, or any of my sort of mistakes or war stories, I'm happy to share those. And yeah, like that's the best place to catch me.
Amazing. Well, yeah, thanks so much again for coming on the show, Nan. It's been super, like, really, really interesting and insightful to hear your thoughts and your journey. So thank you so much for sharing it with us. And yeah, we'll catch you around.
Great. Thanks, James, for the insightful questions. I feel like Baby Yoda.
Thanks for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. If you want to get my takeaways, the things that I learnt from this episode, please go to graduatetheory.com/subscribe, where you can get my takeaways and all the information about each episode straight to your inbox. Thanks so much for listening again today, and we're looking forward to seeing you next week.